All right, so welcome to another Fireside engineering chat. Got a few more people on this one, so we're gonna cover kind of a few different topics here. But for everybody who's just joining, whether or not you've seen one of these before or not, kind of we just bring our engineering team on to really just talk about kind of different topics that we see happening within the space of web analytics, kind of some of the different things that we're working on, things that we're seeing in the industry, and really just kind of talk through it. So if you guys have any questions about anything you want us to kind of dive into, um, just let us know what you have in mind, and we'll be kind of monitoring the chat, and then we'll be doing kind of a Q&A session towards the end as well. So, but feel free to use the chat at any point and throw in any ideas you have. Otherwise, we're just going to kind of talk about whatever comes to mind here. So, quick round of introductions. My name is Seth Rugi. I've been working at InfoTrust for 5 years. I'm the lead of our automations team. So our team really focuses on scaling out solution, GA, GTM, and the whole marketing platform for a lot of our larger clients using kind of the Google Analytics and different APIs to manage that. So I'll pass it off to Tyler since he's off of mute.
Yeah, so I previously and somewhat still currently was the lead engineer of our integrations team. You can think of integrations as sort of ETL like work, connecting data in the cloud. We're primarily a data analytics company, so usually data associated with analytics and marketing. The integration team really brings all that together so you can activate in marketing or improve your website or get the dashboards that you are looking for. We integrate heavily with the data science team. I'm sort of transitioning into a role that is more trying to get ahead of the market and what we're doing in an architecture style role. So that'll make sense what I'm about to talk about. Since I just introduced the integration team, I'll throw over to Mike, who's another member of the integration team.
Yeah, I'm Mike Lehman. I've been around for almost 6 months now. I'm a developer on the integrations team, working with just different ETL solutions that our clients need.
Lastly but not least, Aaron.
Yeah. Sorry, there's a car alarm going off in the background. My name is Aaron Murphy. I'm a digital analytics engineer here at InfoTrust. My home is the automation team, so I work with Seth quite a bit, and I also help out occasionally with integration projects. Yeah.
So let's get into it. The market's volatile right now, guys. We're seeing a lot of change in digital marketing. The landscape is pretty drastically altering, and it's due to security. It's due to people wanting data privacy. So we're seeing things like ITP. I can't remember off the cuff, but Google has a plan for similar requirements with third-party cookies and things coming in the future. So we're seeing third-party tracking breaking as a whole, and it'll work somewhere and not other places. And data coverage is weakening. So we're seeing a rise in different styles of collection. So to give a huge history lesson going back 5 years, when I've been with InfoTrust a little over 6 years, and when I first joined InfoTrust, we did a project for a company. I can't say the company, but they wanted to do all their tracking on the back end, which was a wild concept back then. There was no server-side tracking, and they really wanted to send everything through the back end, which was a challenge of figuring out how the network would work with different tags. How would they be able to, if they use IP for the client-side tags, to be able to figure out where that data came from, and just figuring out server-side tracking. And they were kind of ahead of the game. Back then, there was only one real win case for server-side tracking, which was basically, there's a couple win cases, but one being, you're kind of in control and collect some of that data on your server side and collect some of your own data while sending it out to third parties. But largely it was site performance. And that win case will always be pretty paramount. So the win case of site performance is becoming more and more popular. I think in 2 months, Google's switching their SEO to be largely based off of site performance. So a lot of people are in this race to, how do we get site performance up? Because we might take a big SEO hit in the coming future. And what that's kind of done to the market is, you saw most of the major tag managements are in a race to get to server side now. They're trying to figure out what's going on. And that market is looking pretty wild. There's concepts like Segment, which isn't necessarily a TMS, but it's a place to send your data through. they use something similar to what most people have seen from things like heap analytics and in some ways GA4, which is an event-based tracking that's meant to hold a session in place. It's supposed to be, think of it like a session recorder for a customer. As they go through, we're recording all the touch points with no real interest in where we're sitting them. We just want to make sure we accurately understand within a given session all of the touch points that happen and all the metadata that should be tied to those things. That's sort of the concept. And you saw that with heap analytics. You see it to a degree with GA4, maybe a little more sophisticated in GA4's in camp. But what Segment's doing is largely not caring about sending it to heap or GA4, but really just holding those pieces of data that replay it, and then the ability to replay it out to all of your analytics places, either in real time or historically. So if you sign on another customer or another client or vendor, you're able to replay some of that data back. You actually have this sea of data that you can sort of replay out. It's centralizing your data sources. That achieves a couple of things that are really, really important in today's climate. It achieves one, what have we been screaming about data layers for so many years? It's a unified point of collection. So all your data is going to be uniform across all those places. You're not collecting user ID and uppercase and lowercase here. It's all going through segments. So as it's replayed out, you're going to have that uniformity in your data down the line. So, especially in the integration role with Mike and I, uniform data is pretty important because we have to combine all of that data. So that's pretty important. It takes site performance down, because you're only sending to one place and then replaying it out. And then largely with third-party cookie going away, so does cookie match tables. These marketers are scrambling to figure out, how are we going to be able to replay out to these people? How are we going to be able to make remarketing or different segments to reach out to these people when there's no cookie match tables going? So this is a segment allows for you to tie into platforms. LiveRamp is one that comes to mind that are using some sorts of metadata in some levels where it's legal, PII, to get these IDs from these marketing platforms. So I'm going to talk to my fellow engineers about this, and rather than just pontificate on the subject, but I'd like to stay in the space for a minute, just talking about, where server-side is at, where we think it's going. If anybody has any thoughts, they can jump in, or I can keep going on that. Does anybody want to jump in and talk about server-side for a little while?
Yeah, so it's interesting to me because in the last 5 years, so my previous job, we spent a ton of money on building this light version of the website, right? It's very popular right now to have a very light, bare bones version of your website for people that have very slow internet connections, older cell phones, whatever it may be. But the analytics world has kind of fallen behind on that, because you're capping this at I want to have 50 KB of load before they actually see something useful, that kind of thing. But then they're still shooting off these things to 10 different analytics spaces,
Yes.
which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we're kind of lagging behind a little bit, and this will help catch up to those light versions, I believe, and help kind of make your websites much more accessible to people that we don't generally think about in the US, people that we generally don't think about because we all, for the most part, have pretty good internet connections, decent internet connections, at least 4G.
Yeah.
So so that's going to be interesting.
Here's an interesting tidbit on top of that too, is to understand how internet connections work with tags, just understanding what is the network stack doing with tags, because people sort of, I hear a lot cell phone speeds are increasing, so does it really matter? Are we going to load things faster? So really understanding how network works on the client side is pretty important. One thing to consider is there's only a number of connections or connection threads that you can open from a browser, and it's different per operating systems, ranging from 8 to 32. You can have so many connections open at a time. So if you have, we'll use the 8 example, it's easier to wrap your head around. If you have 8 possible connections that you can make at a given time, one of those for sure guaranteed is going to be your HTML document getting downloaded. It's going to be the actual file of the website. That's what's going to be getting loaded. And then as that loads, it's going to kick off other loads, like load Google Analytics. Do we have A/B testing? Load the Facebook tag. Keep checking off tags. Well, if you max those threads, you're now waiting for more threads to load, and that will impact page load. You're splitting that connection up 8 ways, and that is going to impact that. So look at the individual version of those connections, and you think, well, it's kilobytes of data. This should load fast. However, we're not just talking about download. There's server response time. There's reaching out. The concept of reaching out in that network call is, and I'll try not to get too far in the weeds from engineering. So if we think about these like 8 highways, and we need to load a tag, even if it's a very, very small tag, we have to say, hey, Google Analytics, we need, this extremely small tag from you. And we are at the whim of Google servers saying, oh, yes, that's this tag. Let me load this back to you. And then starting that response and then closing that connection thread. So it's not just the size of them, but also the latency of going through them. So as this problem conflates, you get like more and more tags and you're fighting over these highways, if you will, these pipelines. You start to hit these weird periods where it's like, well, my site loads really fast and then it's got this glitchy period and then it loads fast again because you kind of clogged up all the tubes. The beauty in server side, whether it be any of the solutions that are out there right now, is there's one pipe. You're no longer, if you have 15 tags, you send all 15 tags at once by sending one connection thread to a server that's separate from your client loading. And now you don't have to worry about timings. And that's, it would be a shame for me not to point up to Tag Inspector. So Tag Inspector is one of our internal products. And now while none of us work on the Tag Inspector team, we do work closely with it. And it is a product that very much audits those pipelines that I'm talking about, those different hits. And we're working on what a Tag Inspector plan will look like in the server-side world right now. That's not quite figured out because server-side's new, but this is sort of a network problem. Another thing that I want to add on to that, Mike, is you're sort of touching onto what could be a brilliant future case. I've been thinking about, what do microsites look like in the future? If we have this concept of now server-side tracking, what does a microsite look like now? Because largely they've been bare bones, but you can kind of do some cool things within Google Cloud. If you were to use Google App Engine to serve up a little microsite, just this tiny little thing, or even if you got really wild and tried to use some serverless functions underneath that and really save cost, you now have a cloud-based ecosystem where you're catching both local analytics, and you can use your network traffic and network logs inside that ecosystem to also work alongside this server-side container that's living in the same space in the cloud. So you can get sort of your analytics replay data living right next to your site data, and it's all in this tight ecosystem where you can kind of make that work.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I'm working on a server-side POC at the moment, actually, so this is an interesting topic. But it's kind of one of the things that we're really interested in. You kind of tapped on the like eight-lane highway kind of thing. What happens if the first 8 lanes go through and then the user closes their browser, right? And then you're missing 4 other lanes of analytics reporting things. One of the interesting things that we are looking at is like, okay, how do our metrics serving it from server side compared to the metrics when it is client side? Because we assume that there's going to be some lost data on client side that wouldn't happen on server side. So I think that that'll be really interesting to figure out how much data is actually lost by literally anything, right? Network interruptions, hardware interruptions, and it literally could be anything that stops that.
I think an interesting area to kind of take that to also is really the mobile space. So the way that Android and iOS handle those requests is also a lot different than it's handled on the web. Because on the web, you kind of have constant connectivity for the most part. However, the way that Android and iOS handle those is they batch them, and then I want to say it's like 2 minutes or so, they push all of those requests to whatever platforms there are. If that's only one request, that's going to work a lot easier than having to send 8 or dozens. But then the other huge benefit, which I don't think this is talked about nearly enough, is that, so right now, right now it's pretty easy to implement most tags on websites, but most of the platforms don't support ways to do mobile like analytics tracking for native applications. But what this means is that the analytics tracking tools no longer have to build a native tracking system similar to Firebase. They no longer need to do GTM server side or GTM like mobile. It's rather they are just saying, hey, here's this event. It sends off that request to the GTM server. And then those are all handled the same way, whether it's coming from a native app, whether it's coming from a website. You don't have to worry about whether that really, it could be a 5-year-old, like whatever, like doesn't matter what device it is. Really, all you're doing is sending a network request with the event name and or event parameters, which works just like any other HTTP request. So you no longer have to worry about what are we capable of using on this, because you're no longer doing that. You just send an HTTP request. So that's a huge benefit, both for the perspective of being able to track it, but then also it's going to make it a lot easier for any of these other like third-party companies to implement their solutions on native mobile apps. Yeah,
it creates a new problem too. So what's going on right now is we're seeing Segment's fairly in a good position to start. I started this talking about Segment because they're fairly in a good position to take some of the market share right now. Why is that? The very first thing I talked about is way back when I did a special server-side implementation that was custom for a client early on at the days at InfoTrust. And a lot of what we were figuring out is how do we mimic that front-end hit, mimic that network so we don't lose any of that data. Right now, the big players in the server-side game are Telium, sort of Segment, not really, but it's doing something that allows that to happen. And now GTM server-side. Segment has figured out a way to replay that data for a lot of platforms. Telium a little bit less. GA or GTM server side right now is just GA4 and Google Analytics Classic, or the UA tags. Those everyone's going to catch up. The market's eventually going to balance out. This is just something that is, but it's created a problem, and that's why we're seeing this weird volatile market right now, where it's like, when is the time to go all in on server side? It's a interesting conversation, because if how many tags can I move over? Exactly like Seth's talking about, this solves mobile in a big way, but we need to make sure all the tags we're collecting are mobile or in these server-side platforms, which is an eventuality. That is where the world is going, and it's going to happen. Figuring out the plan on when to act is probably one of the most important things right now, because it's going to create efficiencies and honestly just better solutions in that space. So that's a thing to keep your eye out.
Sorry, if I could also add a point, going back to like web, I have seen with some of our very large clients certain instances of tags that can actually delay like loading of the page by a few seconds, and for a very large e-commerce website, that's a pretty big hit in user experience, especially if you have slow internet, where the request is being held up even longer than you'd normally expect. So I think both in the mobile and in web space, there's a lot of huge benefits to be seen from this.
Yep, 100%. And wrong hand. I'm going to point back to Tag Inspector again. I'm not great at this, guys. So that's one of the big things that Tag Inspector does, is it will run scans on your website as a bunch of different devices with a bunch of different connections and find out those loading points. We all know as an industry standard that if a user's loading, if your page is loading weird, it's going slow, users leave. We all like to praise Amazon for the one-click checkout, and what is the easiest way to, that's a big UX breakthrough. It's the easiest way to get to a sale. Just one click and we're done. It's coming to your house. And making it easy as possible is important. So what Tag Inspector will do, if you're losing money because of slow site sales, you will save a lot of money by getting into Tag Inspector and finding out this information. Another point that I wanted to make, we've talked about network quite a bit, but one thing that Mike was getting into, which is another huge piece of this, is data retention. And he was talking about data retention and the concept of timing and hits. So you send one hit and now you send to all your data. So rather than have to wait for 15 hits to get your data to 15 places, one hit is all you need, and that's going to increase data retention. Another huge piece is third-party tracking is now going to be largely broken as the world's going forward, and ad blockers are real popular. People are learning about ad blockers, and they're blocking all kinds of tags that just won't go through. And browsers are beginning to block certain third-party locations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something Simo Ohava said. If you don't know who Simo is, please don't leave right now. But as soon as you're done with this meeting, go look him up because he is a great source of information on the field. But Simo was talking about our responsibility when moving into this space. I preface this with what he was saying, because what I'm about to tell you is both seems very powerful to a marketer, but is also scary when you're talking about data compliance. They have no say where this data goes. When you're sending data, you can basically configure a server-side container to look like it's going to your website. So let's say, for example, you all signed up for this Fireside chat. You filled out a form, you wanted to get an email. The data had to be sent somewhere for us to be able to contact you. We had to send it to our server side somewhere at that point. Well, we also could send the same style of payload back to our server-side container that's going to replay that to all these analytics places, and or marketing, and name your tags, and you largely will have no idea where that's going, and you won't be able to block it because it looks like it's talking to our server. So data compliance is now in the hands of the business, and there is a responsibility more than ever to cover compliance in the right way. So you need to say, hey, everybody's used to those cookie accept forms now with GDPR and CCPA at the bottom, but you should not be sending data anywhere that you shouldn't be sending it now. But it is largely in the business's hands now. The world is definitely changing.
Now, okay, we've said a lot of positive things about this. There's got to be a reason why we didn't do this 10 years ago, right? Why
Single
we didn't
point
do
of
this
failure.
5 years ago, huh?
One, the market didn't need it. So who wants to mess with their marketing platforms right now? So I'm going to get into marketing, which is my last point I want to touch, and I'm going to throw it over some topics that I know that a couple of the other team members wanted to talk about a little bit. So we're kind of hitting this subject, and if you guys have questions and want to dive into this, we can go into this in other weeks, or we can expand on it. I just want to make sure I'm not dominating the concepts. But why did we not do this earlier? One, you have all these marketing platforms set up. Why are you going to risk and put all of the work into moving this to the server if you're generally happy with site speed? Like, it's not affecting SEO right now too bad. There's people that have achieved the site speed like a perfect world, so it's not really a problem for speed. We have good data retention. All of our marketing channels are working correctly. Why are we going to change this? So the company that I worked with, I think, was ahead of the game and trying to figure this out before and just being ready for that. So why is it happening now? Well, the third party problem, and site speed becoming more and more important. So that's forcing the market's hand, and people are scrambling to be the first there. So are there benefits to it? Another huge point is this is a single point of failure. If you don't have your user ID, there goes user ID tracking for everything. If user ID does not get sent from, you will still need some front end tagging to consume the back end tagging, right? You need something that's going to send this to the server side. And if something in that front end tagging breaks, it's going to break effectively all of the pipelines. So it is a single point of failure. What does that mean? We're used to tested releases for software cycles. There needs to be very tested releases on analytics deployment cycles. The consumings of these have to be very, very tested. The last piece that I'll talk about is marketing is largely broken right now. Everything was going off of cookie match tables and fingerprinting. So we're seeing a lot of new concepts like clean rooms dominating the space. I'll talk very, very briefly on ADH. ADH is Ads Data Hub. It's Google's answer to big data in the ad sphere. And what is a clean room? What's the concept of a clean room? Google has match tables that we will never be able to see. This is their data, and they don't want us in that data. It's a compliance issue. They know that they've managed it correctly. They can't know that the world's going to manage it correctly. So they don't want us to have access to that data. However, they could let us use that data as long as they don't ever let us know who are the people that we're querying. So what that means is I might have a client ID. Now they might have some PII or other things tied to that client ID, and it's kept securely, and other, but or advertisers IDs and lots of IDs tied to that, but they don't want to let me know all that information. But I have this client ID, and I want to know. This already kind of happens naturally, but it's an easy example to wrap your head around. I want to know from this client ID, what is their AdWords ID? How can I average? So I've got this list, this segment that I made, and you can cross query with Google's clean room and get IDs back that normally you would have no access to. And the way they maintain keeping GDPR kind of up in this is there's like a limit of 50 people that you have to have coming back in every segment. Most segments are much larger than that. But over time, you're querying and building out your data set with a data set you don't have access to. You're just kind of augmenting it with some richer data. And the only responses you get back are just advertising IDs that you can then activate on platforms. So we're seeing a lot of that coming, and that's creating a need for more user ID linkage across all of your accounts, which means if it's all flowing through one place with the same IDs, server side, then you have this uniformity, and all of your data can then talk to each other and then talk to the ways to activate in marketing, which is a vastly changing world right now. All right.
I think you covered a whole lot there.
Yeah. That was a deep dive. All right, I'm gonna throw it to you guys.
I'm gonna pose the question to you because I think you're probably the best one to answer it. We got a question from Lloyd. What's your view on unified ID, and can Tag Inspector track this ID?
So I'm assuming with unified ID, you're talking about, like a centralized ID between all platforms. And if that's the case, 100%. Right now, I'm going to talk about what that looks like in server side and what that looks like in client side, and what we're considering now, and where we think the market's going to go. So Tag Inspector real time, this is how it works. You have Tag Inspector scans will identify all the network places that you're sending data from the front end. So there's a scan, which is, you would think of like a web crawler. It's just going to crawl and figure out what are you sending to everywhere. We're going to crawl your whole website and look at all the network tags. And we'll figure that out. So we can tell you every tag that's firing. We also have a tag classification library, which is sort of our magnum opus on that product, because we know any network, whoever's trying to hide, we know exactly what platform it's sending and what data it's sending to. So that is how scan largely works. But while I think scan is a very, very powerful tool, and it figures out those network problems that I was talking about before and how you can benefit, I think real time is even more powerful, because it's targeting the concept of quality assurance and data consumption, which is sort of what your question's asking. And what you can do is, for all the platforms that you're sending that unified ID, it can verify that you have the same ID sent to 15 other places, or all of these other places, and it'll check whenever this network call comes through, what in the payload was this thing present, and did it follow this criteria? And you can basically set up JavaScript or JavaScript like base rules on all of your tags to verify something is happening every time, and then you get alerts when some threshold of that is crossed and it is no longer happening. So if you're tracking breaks in those places. So I think the concept of a CDP using a unified ID and building out a CDP is the future. That is, everybody needs to have all their IDs linked everywhere. As we're building data lakes and data warehouses, those mapping tables, to be able to bring all of them in and to have a single customer view, is the future. And we can interface with these tables at a scale that we've never seen before with cloud computing and concepts like BigQuery. So yes, Tag Inspector can help, and that is the right type of question to be asking. Also,
I think a big thing to add there too is just the importance of trying to heavily encourage users to log in. Yeah. Like that gives you so much more access to then be able to tie those users together everywhere. Even non-e-commerce sites find ways to do that. I think common examples is like grocery stores or like gas stations even, that incentivize you to use scan a barcode, and yep, it gives you a benefit. It gives the consumer a benefit, but then that also gives so much more data to the business to be able to help work towards kind of that concept of a unified experience, and allows you to track kind of where those users are going, what they're doing, and gives a whole lot to that. That then makes it easier, both from the perspective of being able to track what they're doing, but then also gives you a lot of access to kind of creating those audiences that are more developed between these different platforms.
Lloyd, give me some time and I'll shoot you over a deck to your email that will answer some of what you're saying, and I think would be decent for you. I was going to talk on the back end too about GTM server side and what we're looking at for, it's the same concept, except for you're not really going to crawl it. The crawling of a website will tell you, what hits are you sending to server side, and is that working correctly? But you won't necessarily be picking up tags as much, other than A/B testing tags that have to live on the front end. Sort of, those are also going to server side, but in a weird way. It won't be the same thing. That's a drastically changing world. But I don't understand at this point how much control we will have inside these containers. Once these start getting fleshed out, how much control do we have in the cloud? But what I do know is these are cloud-based services that do have a network, and we can understand the network activity that's coming in and out of them and what's happening. I would like to figure out session identification. We are banging around with concepts of meta tag IDs to understand how far data is flowing. And we're trying to map out what exactly that world's going to look like. We're very much ahead of it. But as it fleshes out, we're kind of on our feet and on our toes looking at what that world's going to look like. But that is one of just the concept of a unified ID and server side. That is one of the benefits, is like you can just replay that ID through whatever channels go through all of those. It's a configuration thing rather than, a collection problem. Yes, for sure, Lloyd. Yes. I'll get that sent over to you. Okay, so other subjects, guys. I think I've beaten this one into the ground.
No worries. It's always a good one to talk about. It's so relevant right now and in so many different ways, because it really kind of ties into everything that's really going on in the space between like clean room, server side, ITP, even like iOS and Android are working on more data privacy, and then there's consent management platforms. Kind of everything ties together so heavily with server side tracking, because in a lot of ways it solves many of those problems kind of at the same time. So I think we'll probably continue to be looping back onto it in pretty much every one of these for a little while until the space is kind of leveled out some. But yeah, let's see, where should we go next?
I think Lloyd has another question. He said, can you share with the group the best practices for server-side tagging or tracking?
It's a pretty broad question. I'm not sure where to start with that. We did go a little more in depth in, I want to say 2 months ago or 2 sessions ago. We focused a lot more specifically on GTM server side, around how to set that up, kind of what the cost implications were, and details around that. But for the most part, it's really about understanding what your data architecture is, because that really is the key part of, you really have to know what events you're trying to track, because then once you have that defined, then you're just sending it out to wherever you want to go. So regardless of what platform you're currently on, it's really, you want to have a consistent list of, here are the events that we're trying to track and what platforms we're trying to send that to. And then you're really just making sure that you have all of that data in the areas that you need to have. Because then, like we had mentioned, you're really just sending one event to the GTM server side or Signal or whichever thing, and then that's passing it out to the different platforms. So
it sounds like specifically you're talking about Telium and Adobe. I don't think much changes with the concept of what analytics platform you're talking to as far as best practices with server side. As long as it integrates well, you're largely just sending the hits in the way that you would on the client side. But and Seth was mostly touching on this point, is the strength in front end connecting with server side is a robust plan for everything we ever think we're going to collect, whether we're firing tags on it or not. Let's get all the data, every possible event, every possible interaction. If we're talking about scroll depth, we're talking about like any concept of engagement that we have on the front end, make sure that you have some sort of event defined and it's being passed on to that server side tagging. And then from there, that's kind of a separate plan. That's the original best practice, is just have everything we're ever possibly going to send out, all the pieces of data that we need. Anything that comes in, we have it tested and it's ready and it's all flowing into this box. Just think of it as a box, the server side container. And then what we do in that box is ultimately up to us. So You want to make sure you have a strategy on uniformity. So if we talked about unified ID earlier, that needs to go everywhere. If we have it, that needs to be set up to go to all. And it's about the strategy of how are we going to connect these down the line? What is the business use of this platform? Do we have redundant platforms? Are we able to get this data out and use it in a meaningful way? Are we getting the data there to do the actions or insights that we need? Start asking yourself these questions for each platform, and largely how you engage with each platform on the server side can be unique. As long as you're checking those boxes and you understand how it interfaces an overall tagging plan. Tag Inspector, the product, lies under a team that we have called Tag Governance. I shouldn't say lies under, they live almost parallel, but we have a Tag Governance team and obviously the Tag Inspector product team. Tag Governance deals in that world exactly. So you're going to use Tag Inspector to get an audit of all the things you're sending data to, and then say, why do you have these two redundant platforms? Why aren't you sending this data here? What is your plan? Should we move this later on in the tag? Like Tag Governance largely works in the space of auditing your current tagging systems and figuring out how to, optimize it completely.
I think one of the concepts, which is kind of an offshoot, but I think a lot of times we see clients just finding new use cases to pull in new platforms. So this whatever tagging platform solves one small part of what they're looking for. Maybe it's like product recommendations, or maybe it's I don't know, certain kinds of demographics. And a lot of that, if you're gathering that correctly, you can kind of build your own data warehouse, and then you're able to manage that. And most of the time we've seen that by clients being able to do that, or kind of using some of our services, they'll often end up saving more rather than having these 5-8 different platforms. By just using the data that they already have and analyzing that in better ways, or better defining that data architecture, you don't need to pull in additional like tagging platforms and things. So I think that's just another thing to consider, is like, if you are sending the same data to a lot of different areas, really assess why you're sending that data to each platform, and what does it really give to you as you kind of complete that. Right, so I think we've beat that one pretty solid. So maybe one thing we can jump into talking about, I know kind of all of our teams lately have been getting really involved into using Google Cloud Platform and kind of the different services that it offers. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, but I think it's valuable to go in at least at a high level and just kind of talk about why GCP and AWS and these different cloud services are so essential in kind of the next iteration of web analytics. Because right now, I think oftentimes a lot of companies are really just using kind of standard hosting, or even using hosting within these platforms, but not really taking advantage of a lot of the features within these serverless architectures, and everybody's kind of trying to make shifts towards it, but there really are a ton of benefits around that, both in terms of the application architecture itself, but then the area that a lot of companies haven't started doing is then also using it for your analytics systems, and then using it for your data processing, data warehousing, and then working towards those more advanced like data science and dashboarding solutions as well. So I think a good thing to consider here is, right now we've been mostly talking about the implementation side of what analytics looks like, and then that just kind of goes off to your marketing platforms, and you get some audiences based off that. But really, to build the full picture, you kind of need to incorporate all of these different elements. So once you have that data, being able to not just have it use that data to create audiences, you need to analyze that data in a way that's going to help you grow. So creating CLV models, maybe doing your own internal like product recommendation engine, or finding other other routes to go with that so that you can better understand what your customers are doing. And then you can also use like dashboarding services to kind of take all of those different platforms that you're analyzing and really see how it connects together in a more succinct way. Because right now there's not a lot of ways. Maybe your Facebook team's telling you, hey, we're getting this data, at Google Ads is giving you something else, Criteo is giving you something else. You have this data in a lot of different places, but right now it's difficult for most companies to really act on that data because it is so segmented. And that's where using things like BigQuery, which is going to give you much better querying speeds and costs than having to house that data in a standard database or things like that, because you pay for the usage of it rather than having to just pay for like having the servers themselves. And I think feel free to jump in at any point. I'm just trying to keep it going here. So Aaron, you look like you want to say something.
So I think something that me and our dashboarding team, which isn't present on the call right now, have been working on is like creating a partnership with Looker, which actually, when you have all of your data loaded into the cloud and BigQuery and such, there's a variety of databases that you can integrate with. Pretty much almost anything that you would want to use. However, we've been discovering that it's an incredibly powerful tool for like ad hoc analysis, like Seth was going into earlier, and really allows people to drill down into like looking at certain things, without having to write custom SQL queries, and just sort of like very easily like browsing your data, I guess would be, yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the proper use of server side, because you were on that subject just a second ago, Seth. Where does it fit? And that's largely what a lot of people are trying to figure out. It has seemingly endless use cases, but it also has some constraints put on it. So I guess maybe not everybody even knows what server side is. So maybe I should talk about that a little bit. Not server side. I'm saying the wrong word. I'm talking about serverless functions. I want to talk a little bit about serverless as Seth was just talking about it. And this is in Google Cloud. We're a Google Cloud partner, but it's also in AWS. And I believe there's probably an equivalent in Azure, although I don't know it. In AWS would be Lambda, and Google Cloud, it's Cloud Functions. And like, what are they used for? What is their purpose? Where do they fit into this? How do we leverage it? And it's going to lead into things like we were talking about, like BigQuery, and ultimately like very powerful tools for viewing and working through your analytics. But what are the constraints? When I tell you that it costs less than a fraction of a penny to run one of these, you think, okay, why wouldn't we use this all the time? These are very, very cheap. Why am I paying $2,000 a month for an app server when we could be using Cloud Functions? You have to think, what are the constraints that are put on us to be able to use this thing? Why isn't everybody going serverless? Well, one of the biggest constraints is it has to be in a 10-minute run. This individual instance cannot run more than 10 minutes. Why is that? Well, there's no such thing as serverless. What is a server? It's a cloud. It's a computer, or it's a cloud. It's a computer that you're running code on. So typically when we talk like, yeah, I have a server, what you have is a cloud that you're renting, or a computer that you're renting somewhere in the cloud, or you have a computer that is in your office that you own. But it's essentially what a server is. So code can't really be serverless, but when they say serverless, they mean non-dedicated server. This isn't running on just one server, but on this sea of computers that are out there. So as AWS largely blew up the market of cloud, and then very quickly followed Google and Microsoft, pulling in and taking even more of that market share. And what happens when those three companies get into a big battle about who's going to grow in the cloud? They buy a lot of computers, because they have to be ready for any blow up. And as they get the next breakthrough, they need to be able to scale up. Nobody wants to not have enough computers in that business to be able to meet demand. So that creates concepts like, what are we going to do with all these computers? So what serverless is you're renting space on those unused computers. You're basically using them ad hoc whenever you need, and they can put together this giant sea of computers to work. So that's largely why serverless exists, why it's so cheap, and what that world looks like. And how do we use that? How do we use that for processing? There's all these little scripts. I'll give you an example of a serverless function that I ran that should be serverless function. I reach out to Google AdWords, or AdWords is a bad example. I reach out to Bing to find out the Bing advertising data for an individual client, download it as a file, upload it to Google Analytics so that they have their advertising information in Google Analytics so they can see both their conversions, but also their spend in Google Analytics. Look at the entire advertising funnel all in one place. Why do I need a server for that? That always runs in under 10 minutes. It's in and out. It costs less than a penny a day to run. Now that's just something they paid for that value. They paid the upfront cost of development on that. And there's no other cost tied to it. I mean, it costs less than a penny to run a day. It's not costing us anything. So there's a place for these things. Now let's talk about, we have this data. Another piece of cloud functions is they need to mostly be stateless. They can sort of be stateful, but not really. They're running in parallel, and managing state between them is going to be a nightmare. So you want largely to be able to ingest crazy amounts of things that it doesn't matter when they're processed or what they're connected to. It's a processing pipeline. So I have this piece of data, something needs to happen to it, and then it needs to go somewhere else. I don't care when and where that happens. So if we had, a million records that for some reason needed some sort of processing or something, cloud functions are known for their cold start ability. What's a cold start? We've all had websites that we all know Black Friday. If your website's not ready to scale, it's going down. It blew up. Too much thing came in. The computer couldn't scale up fast enough. And that's what we call a cold start. Is nobody's hitting it. A million people are hitting it. How does your website respond? And that's what we mean when cloud functions are great at cold starting. They can immediately take a huge brunt. So if you have these
Did we just lose Tyler?
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
I'm sure he'll be back on in a second.
Yeah.
So I guess, like, in my view, like, an appropriate use of cloud function is exactly how he described, like short running, like quick and easy tasks and scripts. Maybe something you have to run multiple times a day, hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a day, or hundreds of thousands or millions of times a day. I read all the time about companies using serverless functions, to make up the majority of their backend. But I'd say, like, the one use case where it does sort of fall flat would be like extremely long running tasks, something that could take an hour or 2 hours. And let's say, for example, it doesn't make sense to split, whatever process you're trying to run into multiple smaller tasks. I think that the appropriate use case in that case would be something more along the lines of like Cloud Run. In which case you can kind of like boot up a very small like Kubernetes instance and run your code in that platform. I don't think that has a set expiration date, but can also scale as flexibly as cloud functions.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect use case for something that's on some, obviously, like you and Tyler both said, something that doesn't take a long time, but it could run on a schedule or on demand as you need. And like in our space, a very common use case for it is just to enrich your analytics, right? Like I have X ID or whatever it may be, and I want to pull from this API, grab from these 5 data sources, and then pump them into BigQuery or something. And then it's perfect for that because you're running it once a day, you're running it once an hour, you're doing whatever you need. And it costs nothing, absolutely pretty much nothing in the grand scheme of things.
As a counterpoint to that, I think the other huge benefit of serverless architectures in general is really for handling the high load times that so let's say you're an e-commerce website, you're going to probably get slammed Black Friday every year, but you don't need to have that many servers like on standby for the rest of the year, more or less. But by having everything kind of built out to be handled there, you just know it's going to be a little bit more, like your costs are definitely going to be higher there for that period than they would be with on-site. But then you don't have to worry about server maintenance. You don't have to kind of have everything scaled at the level of your max. You're just ready for it to scale at that point.
Well, the other thing, Seth, is like a lot of times, like, logging is taken care of. Security, I guess, like you still have to be secure about the way that you're writing your code and like the way that you handle unsolicited messages, for example, if you have your cloud function exposed on HTTP. But you don't have to worry about, someone using like an exploit, to get into your EC2 instance, or, I know those are upgraded regularly, fairly, but you don't have to worry about vulnerable services running on whatever virtual machine you're hosting.
Yeah, and in Seth's example, like you don't have to convince the 40 ops guys to not sleep for 48 hours in the lead up to Black Friday, right? Because it's all just going to handle itself and scale properly, and you're not all losing sleep for 3 days.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I just thought I'd mention this because this is something I've seen in analytics, where I've seen cloud functions come into play quite a bit, is actually with like backfilling data. For example, if we have a client who will like create a link between like BigQuery and GA, it'll only like fill that data, I think, for it's like 19 months. I don't know the exact time frame, but it won't give you, a like full view of like really historical data. So going back farther than 2 years, a cloud function might be an appropriate use case to backfill certain days which might be missing. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, okay. I think we have a question from Lloyd. It says, how does the business decide on tagging using server-side or serverless functions if they don't know what all of this means? Do you have a beginner guide for businesses to understand server-side, serverless, cloud storage, architecture, and a specific programming language to learn outside of JavaScript to work on the server side? I guess I can address part of this question, and then I think maybe Tyler, if your internet connection is working properly, I think you'd probably be more knowledgeable.
Really quick, on to jump in. I think from a business perspective, one of the best places to start is actually the Crawl, Walk, Run book that we just published a few months ago. That covers high level from the business perspective, kind of what the benefits of each of these kind of different things are. And it doesn't go super in depth to how to actually solve the problems, but it gives you a high level overview of really kind of where the analytics space is going and kind of what those different options kind of are. So that's a good start point. And that's really built for people from like the business teams who are not as technical. So it is more high level on kind of the benefits of that. So yeah, I'll post a link here in the chat, but I'll hand it back over to Aaron.
Yeah. What I just wanted to make a comment. So the good thing about a lot of serverless, serverless functions, Cloud Run, et cetera, is that you can actually write, your solution in a variety of different languages. Like I personally use Java, like JavaScript is in Node.js, Python, Go, and additionally, you can also use like languages that can be transpiled into a supported language like TypeScript. If your developers, I guess, prefer like more like a rigid, kind of like less dynamic language. I do believe even you can even use PHP if you wanted to. I don't believe that you can like tag I don't think you can necessarily do server-side tracking with serverless functions. They'd probably be more of like a supporting aspect to your tracking. So if you wanted to like associate Google Ads campaigns with Google Analytics data, or you want to integrate two platforms, you don't necessarily want to have like a dedicated server just for that single purpose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I technically, I guess you could do server side with serverless, but I don't think you'd get the benefit of a serverless function, because it is just an endpoint. So technically you could, but I don't think it's a good use case for it. you got to think of server side as like its own. It's going to end up being its own web server, so it's constantly running, just waiting for somebody to jump on your site, that kind of thing. And that's one aspect. I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about this. Like, I think one of the things about server side, I guess back to server side a little bit. One of the things about server side that we didn't touch on is like the server aspect of it. The fact that you need another server. Right now we're all just passing the buck on to clients and their network bandwidth, right? And they're sending out those requests as they load the page. Now you're going to need a server that can kind of scale with that. So there is some increased cost there. And it's probably very minimal. It's not serving out nearly as much as your web server is, but there is that aspect of it too. It's going to cost a little bit more to do server side, but it's probably going to result in a better user experience, which is generally worth it.
Yeah, to answer your other question here later around, is server side serverless more secure than client side? Overall, it definitely can be. I think it depends on what you mean by that, because there's several different aspects of security to consider. One benefit of it is like you don't have to worry about, let's say somebody has a browser add-on that could be collecting data that you're sending to anything. So from that aspect, you're going to be way more secure with server side tracking than client side. Thinking about the data management itself, you also are now just storing that data, or you're only gathering that data in one avenue rather than sending it to a bunch of different places. It still is getting sent there, but from the back end rather than kind of going through the front end connection. So let's say somebody's sniffing your web traffic, for example. They no longer can see that I'm sending these events to Google Analytics or to Facebook or whichever platforms. All they see is there's this request that goes to what really shows up as your same website domain. So they can't tell whether or not that's being used for analytics or for just how the application actually works itself. So in a lot of ways, it's a lot more secure. The other thing to consider is you can basically set it up so that you are the only ones who manage your data. And it gives you a lot more data security by having it go through your single pipeline. But hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, Seth, I actually have another point out on this. So we have seen quite a lot of clients who I guess choose not to run any tags on like purchase or sign-in pages, and the whole purpose of that is that theoretically, malicious scripts could be loaded, perhaps unintentionally, but whenever you're loading third-party JavaScript onto your site, you may not necessarily have control over that content. So you're sort of relying on, your vendors for security. A benefit of server-side tracking is that you'd be able to like safely record events without having the risk of third-party code being loaded onto like a transaction page where you're putting in your credit card number, where that could potentially be scraped and sent to a source that you didn't intend it to. So I guess that's another security benefit that would be offered by server-side tracking. It's sort of like a containerization of that aspect of your site away from necessarily the consumer.
Yep. Also, sorry about the connection problems, guys. I just switched DNS servers mid call, so it was a DNS problem, but I should be good now. Tag inspector, if you're doing client side and you're worried about piggybacking tags or malicious tags loading, there's a beautiful graph that you get when you sign up for a tag inspector scan. I actually think you could go to the website and get like one free scan today. The scan's typically like it's an exhaustive scan, so it'll do a lot more than what you get with the free scan, but the free scan will get you an idea about the kind of things that you're getting back. I believe that's still going on. Essentially what it is a graph. So it says the first node is your website. And then as you stepped through that loaded GTM, which loaded these 8 tags, which loaded these 8 from each of them. And you can see, where is this malicious tag coming from? Or like, that's not a tag that we're having, or all of these are in our plan. And then there was a question earlier, how does tag governance, tag inspector work? So tag governance will look at that exhaustive list and say, okay, are you planning on these? These are 2 of these tags. This one, we have a library that says these are probably not safe tags, and you kind of figure out and come up with a plan. And then it's just a matter of sticking to that over time. But it's worth calling that out again. I'll never get used to my fingers being on the opposite side.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an excellent call out for Tag Inspector, especially having seen, that inspection process firsthand. Like I believe, I've seen Tag Inspector, catch situations like this a few times. With some clients.
All right, well, that kind of brings us to the end of our session here. So thank you everybody for joining, and Lloyd, especially for wealth of questions. That was great. Definitely happy to answer more. And I know we'll have our team follow up with you, kind of giving you some more information on what your use case is and kind of helping you talk through.
One thing I want to add on here at the end to plug too, if you are interested in at least the first half today on what we talked about, prompted from Lloyd's question about getting a deck, I reached out to the Tag Inspector product manager and said, hey, let's combine 2 of our decks and get something. We didn't have something with both of those together. So I was reaching out to that, and he said, let's do a webinar on it. So if you're really into that subject, we'll probably do another deep dive webinar just on that subject. You can find those at taginspector.com.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and hope you got some helpful information here. And just a reminder, we are doing these every month. I think the date is still to be determined for next month, but look out for it. We usually do it the 3rd or 4th week of the month, so should be coming sometime at the end of March. But if you have any topics, definitely let us know, and we're happy to plan something and put together some ideas around it. So. All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
See ya.
See ya.